thanks very much for the invite. It's a great pleasure to speak to you. This is at the end of a fairly busy week because I've been giving talks in Europe, in Finland and in Czech Republic, and they've given me a great deal of food for thought. I don't have a complete kind of paper to present to you. I have a series of thoughts about where we are, and a title, Big Talking Heads fan. You find yourself behind the wheel of a large automobile and you think to yourself, well, how did I get here? And this is a terrible title because it's not how I got here, it's how we got here. How have we got to this state in the debate about sex, gender and sport? And I think it's an interesting moment. It's a moment where there is stuff going on. If you follow this closely, you will know that there is a working group established by the International Olympic Committee under the new president of the IOC. And it is investigating the integrity of it's called the fairness and integrity of the female category. And this working group will last maybe 3 or 4 months more, and it will come out with a policy. Now, I don't know who's on the working group. If I did know who's on the working group, I would say, I don't know who's on the working group. I really don't know exactly who's on the working group. But if you look at the policies that are being established by international federations, 2 big and important international federations have adopted a policy that I think is very good, that involves what is called the return of sex testing. It in fact is a policy for sex screening, and it has an exemption for some important and difficult cases, complete androgen insensitivity syndrome cases, that I think is a genuinely tricky area that I can maybe say more about or people might want to raise in discussion. I think there are still some genuinely tricky areas in this debate, areas of substance. So, and I think those are very roughly the CAIS exemptions, the proposal for female and open rather than female and male, the approach that we take to trans-identified females, who you might want to think of as trans males, or trans men playing in male sport. I prefer the term trans-identified females, but we can, I hope you know who the sort of athletes I'm referring to. I think that's an ethically kind of, I've got views on it, but I think it's ethically interesting, and there's room for kind of reasonable, thoughtful discussion of that. And there's some stuff about anti-doping and testosterone in relation to this debate. So there's a small number of, I find, interesting ethical questions. But I think the big stuff, I think, is decided, or in the process of being decided. And it's a big win if it comes out as I think it will, if the IOC recommends sex testing for all international federations. We'll have no trans-identified men in the female category at the Olympics, at World Athletics events, at international elite sport. And that's a win. I think that's a win. It's a win that is limited in certain ways. It is limited because there are now big questions about the level, if you like, below international elite sport, and there are these questions around these 4 areas that I think we need to kind of sort out. But I do think there will be a trickle-down effect. I mean, sorting out the policy of park run is quite a long way from getting the right policy at the IOC. but there's a trickle-down effect, and we can make the same arguments. My own view about the levels question is that it falls with the category question. It's not really a levels of competitiveness or a levels of seriousness question. It's a question about whether you have sex categories. If you have sex categories, they should be fair. Now, in some cases, we shouldn't have sex categories in sport. You know, maybe, I mean, there are arguments about what level of kind of kids' sport you should start separating people out into boys' teams and girls' teams. There are questions about the degree of formality that you have if you're having a kick around in the park. My view is that as soon as you think there's a persuasive argument for having sex categories, they should be fair sex categories. So it's not really an argument about how far trans inclusion should go down. It's an argument about how far sex categories can go down. And you can see, I think someone said on Twitter, that at their hockey club, when you have loads of kids in and they're learning basic hockey skills, you don't want to divide them into boys and girls, you want everyone to learn together. And whichever way you go on that question about mixing up boys and girls, that leads you to the position you take about trans inclusion, trans exclusion, having fair sex categories or whatever. So it's not, I don't think that should be a truly hot potato either. You can have decent, honourable arguments about, good faith arguments about whether training sessions should be mixed, whether lower league categories should be mixed. But that's all it is. So, why are we winning the basic argument? I think it's, in a way, terribly interesting, ethically interesting, philosophically complex. In a way, it's bloody obvious. Right, here we go.
So away they go.
There's just
the racing is off at
a minute of
exactly 8 a.m. local time.
This is Mara commenting on.
Not long after the
You just see
after sun was up.
This is the male elites and the female elites going for the 2 places at the Paris Olympics in the marathon.
If anything,
So it's best male runners in Britain, best female runners in Britain over the marathon.
Due south at the moment.
We're 30 seconds in
Broad walk in the main
to a 2-hour race.
350 metres long. And
Right,
when they go
do we think,
this,
well, they're not trying very hard.
In about 300 or 400 metres, they will
And you can see there's obviously a visible gap already.
Mara, if you were running in this morning and you were in the position of, say, Ben Connor, and you've got the Olympic qualifying
There's a
time,
little gap in the men's, but a bigger gap back
how
to
would
the
you be approaching this? Would you be
women.
absolutely just trying to ensure you're in
And this is
top
just
2
about
and
it.
not
That's,
contribute
I
to
think,
the actual?
nearly all we've got. So you can see this visible gap, at 1 minute. And that will obviously expand into a gap of about 20, well, I can't remember the results, 15, 20 minutes at the end of the marathon. It's bleeding obvious. It's not bleeding obvious enough for these guys who have written a text advocating for the abolition of the female category because the female category makes women small and reduces the potential of female athletes. Now, I think that's a bit of a weird view. Now, this is a slide, diagram that Tommy Bloomberg produced for a paper that we wrote, the paper that said the IOC framework document is unfair, that was followed up by a paper that we wrote advocating for SRY gene testing, sex testing. So this is the first of the 2 key papers. And there are lots of interesting stories about these 2 papers. One is, they are in the Scandinavian Journal for sports science. The Scandinavian Journal for Sports Science isn't kind of the top journal for sports science, although it's getting an increasing profile, partly because it's publishing decent stuff. They're in that journal because the British Journal for Sports Science, BJSM, rejected both papers. They rejected both papers because we use the term biological male, biological female. And the BJSM is, you know, reputed to be the top journal in sports medicine. And it is absolutely shameful, but also very interesting. And they've suffered from this because they've missed out on these are two important papers, and they've messed up on this because of their kind of bias, their capture by advocates of gender identity theory, gender ideology, if you like. They screwed up, and they are widely recognised as having screwed up. So here's the basic case, and of course what I want to point out is that we've got two concentric circles here. This internal one gives the body properties and the bodily distinctions between males and females. And this external circle gives the performance metrics for that correspond to these differences. Now, this is interesting in terms of the argument that it's all socially constructed. Now, what you have to do in order to make that argument is say, right, the fact that males have greater left ventricular mass and a greater lung surface of 25% greater left heart mass, size of your heart, right? 30% greater lung surface. That is unrelated. That has nothing to do with the cycling speed difference. The fact that males have 60% bicep strength, greater bicep strength, has nothing to do with swimming speed. Because you don't want to deny the science of bodily differentiation. You just have to make this causal non-connection claim. And this seems just, okay, height. Why is it that males jump higher than females in the high jump? Well, femur length helps. Helps your levers, helps to have longer levers, and height helps to have helps you get over a higher bar. So what these people need to deny is what looks obvious to us. So I think this is one reason why we're winning the argument. But there's a feature of this that I want to bring out, which I argued about fairly early on in this debate, which I think is helpful and useful and interesting. And that's asymmetry. So the point of asymmetry, of emphasising asymmetry, is just to say that, look, men and women have different types of bodies. It's asymmetric, it looks different. The two types of bodies look different. And that's important because it has policy implications. One of the things that I touched on that we argue about is the female open distinction. And that's obviously asymmetrical, because the symmetrical policy would be female male. Right? So female open is asymmetrical. We argue about the deliberative failures. What I mean by that is the failures in this policy process to talk to female athletes. Now that's huge. I think it's recognised by the other side. There are all sorts of issues about the representation of female athletes in sport. Right? But here's a thing that we don't moan about. The failures to consult male athletes about the inclusion of trans-identified females in male sport. Now, it's absolutely true that the IOC did not consult male athletes about including females who've taken a lot of testosterone and, developed musculature and had whatever surgery and grown beards. No one consulted male athletes about the inclusion of trans men, trans-identified females, in male sport. Why not? No one cares. Right? No one cares because of the asymmetry of policy that follows from the asymmetry of bodies. I mean, I think there are interesting, tricky questions about the inclusion of trans males in especially combat sport. And again, this is one of the sort of slightly ethically tight details to clear up and do some work on. I think there are consent issues about letting blokes hit people who are female but are not recognisably female if the bloke doesn't know that the person is female. But I don't think a trans-identified man running in an open category is a threat to fairness for males in sport. So, I think it varies, and there's kind of interesting, and we need to remember that there's an asymmetry going on here. And this provides us, so I talked about deliberative failure in relation to this. So that's a failure of deliberation, a failure of consultation, a failure of kind of democratic discussion. I haven't talked about the Paralympic analogy. I will do that because it's going through my head. And I think, look, all analogies here are limited. No analogies are perfect. But one of the things that the other side have retreated to is to argue for case-by-case analysis. Right? So I've got a paper that I need to finish called The Case, a case against case by case. So I'm very happy with the title. I just finished the argument. And what they do is they've adopted an analogy with Paralympics. There is a fairly famous athlete, German athlete, Marcus Rehm, who wants to compete in the full Olympics and run, I think it's the 400. And previously this happened with Oscar Pistorius, who did run in the full Olympics. And what these people say, people like Roger Kielka and the other trans rights activists, is, well, we can do the same case-by-case analysis for including trans-identified males, trans women, into the female category. The analogy is wrong, and it's wrong for very interesting reasons. It's wrong for reasons to do with asymmetry, the asymmetry of bodies and the asymmetry of categories. So here we go. What is the proper analogy for the inclusion of trans women into the female category, the inclusion of trans-identified men into female sport? It is this. It is me wanting to compete in the Paralympics. And I used to cycle a lot, and I quite like carbon fibre and flashy, super light, technical bits and pieces. And it looks kind of fun to race these carbon fibre wheelchairs, and I could do with a bit of upper body strength. So why can't I compete in the Paralympics? The Paralympics are not very inclusive, are they? Because they won't let me compete. And then we could embark on a great big research programme to say, what sort of tying together of my feet, of my legs, would remove my able-bodied advantage to allow it to be fair for me to compete in the Paralympics? To which the answer is none. To which the answer is, actually, John, sod off, you rude bastard. The Paralympics are not for you. They're not designed for you. You're not welcome there. It's inappropriate for you to ask. Of course they're exclusive. They're exclusive of you because you're not a Paralympian. You do not have an impairment. If you fall under a tram and you lose both your legs, then it is appropriate for you to compete in the Paralympics. But right now, it's not for you, and it is rude. It is disrespectful for you. It's disrespectful to Paralympians for you to be asked to be included. As I said, this is an open-ended set of reflections, and I can, I'm afraid, bore you for 5, 6, 7 hours on this stuff if you really want. So you have to kind of... Right. So now I want to talk about chauvinism, and there should be a bit more to this. Right. So chauvinism. We used to talk about male chauvinist pigs a lot, and the word chauvinism has fallen out of favour a bit. But I want to kind of reinvigorate it and reintroduce it a little. Chauvinism is from Chauvin, French nationalist, ultra-nationalist. And it means kind of putting yourself first and seeing the world from where you stand. I think there are lots of aspects of chauvinism in the debate about including males in female sport. And here's some that I've been thinking about, partly because I have been confronted by this objection over the last week. Right, so the American trans rights activists, and a lot of them are American, come and say precisely this. It's not about fairness in sport, it's about Trump's assault on the LGBTI community. And I think it's possible. We probably have questions in our mind about the existence of an LGBTI plus community. That's a bit of an assumption that I think we hang on a moment, this is forced teaming, not so sure that there's that community as such. I don't think it's necessary for any of us to say there is nothing in the claim that Trump is launching a discriminatory, politically motivated attack on minorities in the US. I think that's probably true, including sexual minorities. But this is about fairness. This is about fairness for women. So there's a kind of political chauvinism here, that everything is about party politics, that everything is about political ideologies. And I don't think that's the case here. I think that comes very often from people who are much, much more interested in politics than they are in sport. Some of us are interested in both, and we think that sport is a significant social context that to some extent has its own ethics, its own kind of priorities, its own rules, its own kind of organising moral structures. Normally, we don't think that people who are fast should get the best jobs or have the most, who are fast runners or who are tall or who are strong should get universal rewards in life. But we do think that those things figure in sport. Sport has, to some extent, its own rules, its own standards, in which it's one area, probably the only area, in which we reward people for certain kind of physical characteristics. And that's fine within sport. It shouldn't happen in other kind of social contexts, but it's fine within sport. And there's a kind of Americentrism too, that we are supposed to shut up about fairness for women for fear of boosting Donald Trump. And the world is not all around about Donald Trump. The world is not all about American electoral politics. So there's a kind of chauvinism there. There's a chauvinism that this is a political issue, or a political issue in the sense that I've suggested. We decided on whether we're for or against Trump. And there's an Americentrism in that we decide this on the basis of the interests of the US. Maybe it's nothing to do with the interests of the US. And I amended this because I thought the obvious thing is this is about male chauvinism. This is about chauvinism and discrimination against women. Now, I need to say a little bit more about that, because it strikes me that people use the term discrimination a bit loosely in these debates. And I've done some expert witness work for some American court cases where we need to distinguish between different sorts of discrimination. So in terms of those, right, so here we start with something like Title IX, all the sports exemptions in the Equality Act. Now it seems to me that very crudely you could say these are examples of sex discrimination. It is true that if you want to have female sport, and I think female sport is generally a good thing, you need to stop men entering in female sport simply because they are men, simply because they are male. You discriminate against males when you're setting up a female team, and you discriminate on the basis of sex. Now, the Sex Discrimination Act in the UK allowed that, and when it was incorporated into the Equality Act, we get section 193 and 195 that specifically allow single-sex exemptions for sport. So obviously, we are allowed to discriminate, as it were, against men. That's legitimate discrimination against men. So what we've got is not so much So there is sex discrimination in sport. Sorry, I just need to see this. There is sex discrimination in sport, and it's a good thing, and it's proper. We discriminate on the basis of sex, but we shouldn't discriminate against people on the basis of gender identity. This is fairly straightforward. We can see in the case of Quinn, the Canadian footballer who is female, who it's all a bit confusing. Quinn uses they, them pronouns, identifies both as trans and as non-binary. And I think Quinn will probably take testosterone when Quinn ends their soccer career. Right, so that's, I think, the situation. If it were the case that when Quinn came out as trans, Quinn was kicked out of the Canadian soccer team, that would have been unethical and illegal discrimination on the basis of trans identity. And that would have been wrong. Once you look at the case of trans men, or trans-identified females, in these sporting contexts, you can see exactly what the distinction between sex discrimination and discrimination against on the basis of trans identity actually amounts to. No one should be pushed out of a team because they are simply trans. We are not in favour of that, I think. Maybe we need to say that louder. Maybe the people who say we are in favour of that should just shut up because they're wrong. But either way, the distinction between discrimination on the basis of sex and the discrimination on the basis of trans identity is a very important one that we ought to bear in mind. This is one way in which you get to the argument about chauvinism and discrimination at another level. The argument for including trans-identified men, trans women, in female sport is an argument that rests on turning female sport into a handicapped sport. That's to say it rests on the idea that by suppressing someone's testosterone levels, you can make it so they can then compete in female sport without winning all the time. And winning all the time is supposed to be the criterion of fairness. And it isn't a criterion of fairness, as I have argued at some length, and I won't go over all that now. You could reduce the male advantage of all the men in this room by giving us, and we are of varying degrees of fitness, but we all have male advantage. We could all reduce our male advantage by wearing a leaded vest, going out on a run. We could all be placed, and you need to weigh up the weights of the different leaded vests to get it roughly right. We'd all be slower. We could all reduce our times to times, I don't know if there's any elite athletes in the room who run faster than all women, but I won't say. But we could all reduce our times in some way that was roughly commensurate with the male performance metrics that we saw earlier. So what? All that does is show that we've established a handicap race. And it follows from what I was saying earlier about asymmetry, that you only have to reduce the female race to a handicap race. You don't need to do anything about the male race. So what you've then got is a female competition that is reduced and a male competition that is unaffected. And that's what we're being asked to endorse, and that is straightforward sexism. That is just straightforwardly saying women should get a worse deal than men. And I think that's kind of classic, like 1970s Sex Discrimination Act sexism. So it's demonstrable, I think, legally and ethically, that this proposal is a straightforward sexist proposal, apart from having all the chauvinism that I talked about. I hope some way of explaining what's happened in terms of the way in which this has gone in the IOC and the way it's gone in some of the other arguments. The IOC has two departments that have looked at this question, and there's been a bit of a fight between the two of them for control of this policy, and I sort of think neither of them should have control. Right, the two commissions that have had control of this are the Science and Medical Commission and the Human Rights Commission. Two problems with this. The Science and Medicine Commission, unsurprisingly, looks for a scientific and medical fix. Right, they see things in those terms and they look for a solution in those terms. The obvious science and medicine fix has been testosterone suppression. That hasn't worked, but that's the one that they put their eggs in that basket, and it has come unstuck. The Human Rights Commission is worried about things about human rights, which is, of course, I think, a good thing for the sports movement and the International Olympic Committee to think about. But there is no human right involved here. There is no human right to compete in the sex category that is not your biological sex. It just doesn't exist, so there's no human rights argument. There might be a sort of interest argument or a preference argument looking at the preferences of some people, what they would like to do, but that doesn't carry much weight. I will just say something about this last one. Okay, so supposing there are two discourses, and what there is an absence of people who think about fairness carefully, which is, I think, what we need to do here. I think that philosophy has done well here, comparatively well. It's done better than the sociology of sport, and oddly, it's done better than sports science. both the sociology of sport and the science of sport journals have been corrupt. I will say that clearly in this debate. And it's been a major crisis of sport ethics. There's a slight problem for people who describe themselves as philosophers of sport here, because I sometimes get called up and said, and they say, John, we want you to write a report on what the philosophy of sport discipline says about this issue. We want you to represent the standard in this philosophical subdiscipline. And I say, well, I can tell you what I think, and there's people who disagree with it, and there isn't a line. I can tell you, how you should go about thinking this through, what sort of different arguments there are, and which ones are better, which ones are worse. So my solution is not that the IOC should have a philosophy commission, or an ethics commission, or a fairness commission. My solution, and this is not entirely a joke, is that they should ask me more, but they should ask people who have clarified and thought through this issue, and I don't have much more to say about the solutions now, but the argument in the public sphere has been something that I think we, roughly gender-critical people, sex-realist people, have won. All their stuff goes on behind closed doors, and even though Twitter is in many respects a terrible, horrible place where people shout at each other and insult each other and all the rest of it, the fact that we, all the people arguing for fair sport for women, have won Twitter, I think, is a good thing, and thank you to those of you who contributed to this as well. And I will stop there.
Thank you, that was really interesting. I thought the link with the chauvinism was quite interesting, with the sort of American centrism and how it then kind of gets into the political area.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't want to say this isn't a political issue, because it is. But I also want to say, look, this is something where there are different conceptions of fairness in sport that get argued about in the journals, and some of them are terrible and terrible conclusions. I would say there's a very good article on handicap sport, so races in which you have a handicap, which I kind of touched on. And I'm not saying they're a terrible thing. If you have we could have a handicap run along Brighton seafront, and we would all of us could compete. You wouldn't need a sex category. You just, you need someone with a clipboard and a spreadsheet, and with lots of histories of our past times and so on. And of course, the perfect result would be if everyone tried really hard and ran their best race, and everyone crossed the line at the same time. And that would be kind of perfect handicap fairness. So there is a theory of fairness there that, people can adapt. Quite fun. My running club runs a handicap on the Downs at the end of the season. It's great. But this is not women's championship sport. This is not what we're kind of interested in when we support and watch and engage in a women's race. It's just something else. Yeah, I mean, I'm not really against, I suppose I'm not really against the politicisation of this in a way, because I want politics and policy to get this right. Trump has, on this small issue, got it more or less right. Trump's no friend of women. Trump's no friend of people like me, progressives, and people who are concerned about sexism in the world. But he's got this one right. For his own reasons, the Democrats handed it to him on a plate. I think Kara Dansky was speaking at the conference. She warned the Democrats, years ago that if you give up on this, you just hand ammunition to Trump. So, yeah, they did. So I'm most cross with the Democrats, because now we've got Trump as president.
And I guess other people might have questions. So I was wondering, you sort of said about the trickle-down effect, and we're talking obviously about elite sports.
Yeah.
Do you think it will sort of like filter all the way down through to the schools and stuff quite quickly? Do you think it'll be quite a long process to sort of like...
I think it will take quite a long time. I suppose, so what I would say is the activism doesn't stop and cannot stop, and the arguments cannot stop. And for myself, I want to focus some kind of intellectual energies on that particular argument. I think it will trickle down. There will be a trickle-down effect because you kind of won the argument in public, and organisations have changed their policy, and I think there's a ratchet on this policy discussion. I don't think it's going back. I think international federations have in some cases gone through, look, World Athletics I think completely messed it up in any case, but it's also true that they've gone through kind of 9 years of litigatory hell, right? And it's cost them a whole load of money, and they've had like 4 different shots at getting the policy right, and they finally got it right, and their lawyers are very rich, and they've kind of got to more or less fair sport for women. They don't want to go through that again. The trans rights activists got power at the IOC, got power in international federations, and they blew it. They overreached, and their arguments didn't work, and they led to some terrible spectacles. Imane Khalif in Paris, and that shook people up. And they're not going back to that. Kirsty Coventry does not want to go back to that. They know it's unjustifiable. The people who don't know it's unjustifiable were there in this conference in Finland, and they would say, no, get rid of sex testing. What's the problem? We just need to explain that women come in different shapes and sizes. No, you've tried that one, and no one's buying it anymore. So I think there's a ratchet at higher levels. All this is speculation, and I could be wrong, and it's different from the substantive philosophical argument. It's just me speculating, having looked at this fairly closely for a few years. I don't think they want to go back. I don't think there's much chance that they'll go back. I think the TRAs realise that they're defeated. It will trickle down slowly. I mean, obviously, the Supreme Court judgment is a huge boost. There's an interaction of kind of activism, argument, policy change, and sort of the tide of history that is really difficult to unpick. So there's no justification in stopping the activism, I suppose. Football is hanged still. UEFA and FIFA are still in a terrible position. We have, the best women footballer in the world is, the supposed best women footballer in the world is Barbara Bandler, who's male. There's more work to do there. So the extent to which it trickles down, I don't know, and it won't all happen just like that. Certainly, that's all.
So I was going to ask, you mentioned earlier that the sports journals were corrupt, which stood out to me. How so? Who's paying them?
Right, so what I've said is the sociology, the journal, the sociology of sport, and I'm saying it's intellectually corrupt.
Oh, I see. Sorry.
And the British Journal of Sports Medicine, I am saying, I'm aware that this is intellectually corrupt.
Okay.
What I mean is, They have discriminatory practices.
Oh, okay. I thought there'd been an exchange of money somewhere.
No. I don't know.
No. I have another quick question as well. I've heard anecdotally that scouts are going out and looking for people with intersex conditions. Is that true?
My view on that is possibly, but I think it'll stop because they changed the policy. And that doesn't need to be part of the explanation for what Stefan Berman reported at the World Championship. So there's a big story, you probably know. Stefan Berman, who's the medical officer for World Athletics, says there's massive overrepresentation of people with DSDs, particularly 5ARD and partial androgen insensitivity syndrome, in world athletics. I forget the number, he said 60, something like that, athletes. Right, so part of the one explanation is they've been scouted particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, as a way of boosting medal tallies. Honestly, I don't know, and I think it's quite likely. But the reason for the prominence of those athletes is that they have male advantage. So they win. So they win, they go to school and they're fast. They believe themselves, pre-pubertally to be female, let's say. They are fast, they are good at running. They're not that good at running, in fact, but they are better than, the girls are the same age, so they win their high school races, so they go to the regions and they win at the regional championships, and then they get to the national championship, so your 16-year-old, high school runner in wherever is a runner with a DSD condition. So you don't need the scouting explanation, it's just that's how sport works. It will filter in DSD athletes who have male advantage in the female category, and they will be overrepresented. So which explanation is the kind of decisive one? And maybe some investigative journalists could get on the case and in sub-Saharan Africa. I wasn't saying it to you. I was saying, look, maybe let's find out about the scouting practices. How did Imane Khalif get, pushed forward? Was it just that they knocked everyone out? Maybe, or were they particularly scouted? I don't know. Sorry.
You have said something about trans-identified females. So I was just interested if you could just recap on that. And has the trans activist done any advocacy to include trans-identified females taking testosterone in the male category? Because we instinctively know that the testosterone, but that is unfair, don't it? Even if they're competing in the male category, it's unfair. They've got a boost. But have they tried any of the linguistic or other tricks to?
So this gets quite complicated quite quickly, because so a trans-identified female would take testosterone for gender-affirming reasons, and that testosterone would give them advantages. There's a couple of issues here. One is that would give them advantages, but not anything like the advantages you get from the boost of puberty, of testosterone increases at puberty. So it wouldn't be the same level. Secondly, it's doping. So then you would need a therapeutic use exemption. Now you can get a therapeutic use exemption only, and oddly, I got into this all through anti-doping and thinking about therapeutic use exemptions, because they're weird. They're a weird feature of anti-doping regulation, because they say, oh, well, if you're taking it for the right reason, more or less, that's okay. And the right reason is treating a condition. Now, is gender dysphoria, so here are some of the questions, is gender dysphoria the right sort of reason to allow you to take testosterone in competitive athletics? There's a big question about whether we're right to think of gender dysphoria as that sort of condition. Then, if you get into the kind of details of therapeutic use exemptions, you can only get a therapeutic use exemption if it won't give you an advantage in competitive sport that is like any other advantage that you could get from a similar, from another appropriate treatment of your condition. Now, I'm inclined to say people with gender dysphoria ought to get as much help as they can, but that's largely going to be therapeutic. It's going to be, if you like, counselling, it's going to be psychological stuff. And that, of course, gives you, so living with your apparent kind of dysphoric feelings, that's not going to give you performance advantages. So if you say, well, there's an alternative form of treatment here, rather than taking testosterone and having a double mastectomy, that is appropriate for your condition, then you won't get an award of a therapeutic use exemption for taking testosterone. Now, that's the way I kind of try and think my way through it. I don't know. It's quite tricky. I don't think that trans identified females, trans men, just so we know who we're talking about, taking testosterone is a big threat to the fairness of male sport. But in the open category, there is a problem, because my conception of the open category is that if any females want to compete in that, they can compete, and then you've got these other females who are competing in that, but are taking testosterone. And that's an imbalance. And that's kind of an internal problem for the open category, which I accept is kind of, slightly tricky, and there are some issues involved there, but we can think about it.
But the trans rights activists are not talking about that. They're not putting lots of timing on that one, are they?
Are there any women fraternity men trying to get into men's category when they're all the way around?
Well, exactly.
Men weren't consulted about that.
Yeah.
Because no one's trying to get in there.
Exactly. And there is some research coming out that just shows that trans-identified females compete in the female category because they're not stupid. Yeah.
But I mean, they're also not doing like floor gymnastics or synchronized swimming, are they? I mean, they go for the ones where they've got the advantage.
No, trans-identified females competing. Trans-identified females can compete in lots of sports and kind of fine, no problem. If you want to compete in the male category, fine, little bit of a problem. Not, it isn't the huge deal that it is for trans-identified men competing in the female category. And I think maybe we should say that a bit, but it is, there are ethical difficulties there. I've seen lots of hands.
You mentioned the Canadian, the female, the trans-identified female in Canada.
Yeah.
Have there been examples of biological women being kicked out of women's sport because they identify as trans? Has that actually happened?
I want to say no. I don't think that has happened. Now, let me think. The wrestler. There's a high school wrestler who did take testosterone in America and was then, I forget how it goes, he was either told, they were either told, think they might have been told that they could not compete in the female category because they'd taken testosterone, and they could not compete in the male category because of anti-doping regulations.
Yeah, right.
Anyone remember the case? But
that was that's effectively doping.
It was,
yeah.
Look, this throws up some difficulties because I don't want a policy that closes off any route to sport for someone. And there are perhaps some tiny kind of edge cases where constructing that policy is difficult. Certainly if you just say, fuck it, I'm going to take as much testosterone as I want, it's on doctor's prescription, I don't care about TUEs, you are going to exclude yourself from all sport. Don't do it.
Yeah.
I think what you're both speaking to, though, shows the misogyny that's within, you know, the sexism that's at play, because there's so many campaigns to have trans-identified men in female sports, you know, because their gender identity is so important. Where are the campaigns for, where are the trans activists shouting and screaming and having campaigns and lobbying government to have trans-identified women in men's sports? They are, because they know there's pointless, and there's, because it just highlights the unspoken sexism.
Exactly, which stems from the asymmetry. Yeah, I agree. I saw John.
Yeah, right. One very straight observation and then a question. I get the issue with DSDs and people not necessarily in some parts of the world discovering that until adolescence. Always found that a little bit puzzling with Lynn, the Taiwanese boxer from one of the most modern societies in the world, and in the Olympics. I was thinking about your handicap point, and I think if you really take the handicap point all the way, you don't even have to have people, and you don't even have to have the same species in a handicap race. You have horses that are hobble, you can have anything you like, and that kind of always helps me when I hear Joanne Harper talking, and I watched that video quite attentively, the one of you on that panel in Finland, and I thought you did quite well not to get involved with the really kind of bollocks arguments, but the one the Joanne Harper one always feels to me that it's kind of a quite insidious. Well, we'll just if we just bring this down, and it's just one difference among many, and it'll all be sort of fair, and I see this as what's driving this kind of handicap argument a bit. And I've heard people sort of make that argument even about the Olympic boxing. So I think it's a good. Well, I suppose what I'm saying is probably quite a good point to hold on to, the point that you're making. Really. Yeah,
I agree with you that, I mean, it was European philosopher Nick, who said, look, there are these two ways of organising sport: handicap racing and championship racing. And I think it's a very important distinction to keep in mind. On your previous, and it helps explain a lot of this stuff, and it is kind of annoying just to know that if you think about this clearly enough, carefully enough, I mean, we all have the reaction that this is kind of mad. Of course we shouldn't have males in female sport. But then there's kind of the process of arguing it out is, I think, interesting and requires clarity. So you get this nonsense about Michael Phelps, you get this stuff about T suppression, there's only a few of them, all this stuff. I think the first point you made about DSD athletes, and I want to say something very quickly on this, the figure of a DSD, a female DSD athlete who goes to the Olympics and is tested and gets this revelation that they're actually XY and this ruins their life. That is a mythical figure. Totally. That is, there's one possible case, right, from years and years and years ago, but that's a mythical figure. And of course, anyone who says, you get a diagnosis that you're not the sex that you thought you were, should be treated sensitively, and there should be counselling and backup and support and medical and treatment available. And so, of course that's right. But that is different from, that sort of thing happens at 11, 12, 13, right? That is different from this situation that we're supposed to be concerned about, which is turning up to the Olympics and, this stunning revelation. That's not what's going on.
Just adding on to that then, did you say you're writing a paper that's on case or case?
No, although I am.
Case, okay.
I'm writing lots of papers.
Because people do make the argument that it's case women, and I keep saying it's case men.
Right.
And biologically, they shouldn't be in a female category either. Although I get that it's
right
5ARD and.
Okay, so let's distinguish between case CAIS, which I'm going to call CAIS, just for the sake of clarity, and case by case, which is the policy. So you've got the CAIS exemption in World Athletics and World Boxing rules, and so this is for people who you probably all know, but it's people who are completely androgen insensitive. So you do have male levels of testosterone, you are XY, but the testosterone circulating around your body has no androgenizing effect at all. Right, so partial androgenization, I think, is ethically straightforward. You've got male advantage, you should not be in the female category. CAIS cases are, I think, ethically tricky because people like that are phenotypically female. They appear female. And it's difficult to say exactly that they have male advantage, though the explanation might be that they have male advantage from XY, but not male advantage from testosterone. And here you get into this area which, and frankly, I've thought about this a great deal, and I don't know what I think still. Yeah. I think that at the level of policy, the CAIS exemption makes it much, much easier to defend the policy. I think at the level of kind of making the argument as watertight as possible, it is difficult to justify a CAIS exemption. So that's kind of where I am in terms of the difference between winning the policy such that sport is fair for women and figuring it all out at the level of kind of deep policy. That's what I'm writing about. I just think it's a bit maybe brutal to exclude CAIS athletes from the female category, but it keeps me up at night.
I mean, I think there are so many other things at play, and would they be having estrogen and progesterone?
Yeah.
Which I'm assuming they wouldn't, or it'd be coming
It depends,
if it was injected or if it was coming from their internal testes at very, very low levels.
Yes.
Which would still be.
Yeah, I mean, I've talked to Emma about this,
Okay, cool.
and we're both, right, the people who are thinking about this all the time think about the CAIS exemption all the time and worry about it, and there was a very good thread from someone who knows a lot about this, and I don't think it's something that we should hugely fall out about. I think it's something that we should disagree about and think about. And the expertise here is again multidisciplinary. You need input from developmental biologists like Emma. You need to look at the sports scientists. I need to think about it more. So do the policy people, and we're kind of right. It's an issue where a policy has certain kind of attributes. We want the policy to be accepted as justifiable. We want it to be easy to implement. We want it to be really relatively cheap to implement. We want it to not lead to obvious injustices. We want it to be congruent with the underlying biology and principles. We don't want it to be cruel
Yeah.
All these things, put them in the pot, try and work it out carefully. That's as far as I've gone now.
I just agree with the way that you were saying that, you know, in essence, our side just kind of won that area of it on Twitter and things like that.
Oh, the Kais bit, I think, is our... Right, sorry.
Is where, like, Debbie Hayton still talk about Kais women. There's a non-binary woman at work that has started bringing it up. And usually they've just been talking about intersex, but she specifically said Kais at one point.
Yeah, well, I suppose what I think is, I said this once with reference, and it was a bit of a slighting thing. I said, look, if we're going to argue, if we're just arguing about pool, this is another thing. Well, we did argue about pool, and we won the argument about pool, and pool is sex affected, and you shouldn't have trans identified men playing women's pool. So we sorted that one out. But I said this slightly disparaging thing, which is, if this argument is now about pool, well, we're pretty close to having won. If this argument is about Kais, I do kind of feel the same thing, that we're fairly close to just, you know, we're arguing about the details of a policy that preserves fair sport for women. I don't know, you know, the degree to which people share that view. And it is, you know, the details do matter. And so, you know, the idea that someone under 12 on puberty blockers is allowed to play women's, what was it? What was the under 12 one that just came out? Not badminton. Anyway, you know these little anomalies, if you've followed this debate, where, you know, in this case, the policy might go the wrong way because it allows the use of puberty blockers and whatever. I think on the one hand, we need to close all those loopholes. On the other hand, we don't want to be completely brutal, but I think we're winning. You know, the policy, most of the policies are. Sorry, all the policies I've seen, I think, will substantially do the job of keeping men and male advantage out of women's sport, and there's some details that we need to work on.
Thank you.
It's just some of the things that was striking as you were talking about the kind of human rights bit, and then I guess it came back in my mind when you were talking about, you know, we can't be cruel, we can't be brutal, and it feels like the human rights of a small minority of trans-identified men are always kind of considered, and I feel like it feels like it's very rarely really considered, like who's thinking about the human rights of women? Why are we always kind of left out of that? And I've been at a session at Philly around equality impact assessments, and even though we have a protected characteristic of sex that we share with men, we're so often left out of just the very basic human rights discussions and questions and thoughts and I think it comes down to some stuff Michael saying, that we just don't seem like we as a group matter, even though we're talking about female sport. It's the tiny minority that's trying to get into women's sports that we spend all of our energy and our time kind of thinking about and worrying about them and what about them, and the actual bigger group. Just a reflection. It's not a criticism, because I appreciate your work and everything. It's just
So
I'm looking at it through a woman's eyes with a daughter who's training for elite sports herself.
Wow. Well, good luck to her. It's the first thing. I agree with you broadly. So I think the human rights approach is not a good approach to this debate at all. I think women have a right to fair sport, and that's been ignored. Now, for kind of technical reasons, I don't think it's a basic human right, because I think basic human rights are to things that are kind of pre-social, like food and water and shelter and so on. So basically, the language of basic human rights has been hugely inflated, and this is not an issue about basic human rights. It might be an issue about rights. I think women have a right to fair sport. Males do not have a right to identify into female sport. Trans-identified females do not have a right to compete in male sport. Now, it's not a right. We could just say, no, I don't see, huge problems in granting that permission, but there's no right there. There's no right, certainly, for males to compete in female sport at any level, anywhere, under any circumstances. There's just no right. It doesn't exist. Because if you do allow it, this is, what's that thing? Exploding in a puff of logic stuff. It's just exploding in a puff of logic. If you allow men to compete in female sport, it's not female sport. So you can't have a right to destroy a category. You can't have a right to something that's logically impossible.
Surely the case example is why are we even worrying about whether their levels are low enough? From a policy point of view, should have started when we have male and female sport.
Yes.
How genetically affected you are for whatever condition you have that makes you.
Well, if you
could compete, it's kind of, I understand why, from a fairness point of view, you could make the argument.
Yeah.
But given the levels of general ignorance and the levels of TRA lies,
yeah.
It's a thin end of a wedge to all the other problems we have.
I don't think it's a thin end of a wedge, because I think what's the alternative metaphor when it's the last residual anomaly, something like that, rather than the thin end of a wedge. I think that we've gone in, sorry, you're wanting us to wind up. Yeah, I think it's closed. Honestly, we're winning, we've won. It's kind of over. It's not over in all the ways I suggested it's not over. There's a case anomaly that is up for review. There's still work to do. Stuff in schools, but I honestly think we can a thin end of a wedge would suggest we are under threat for this opening itself up again. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's the case. I think the argument's failed, the research has failed. I don't know if you saw, am I still on? IOC's removed funding from all the programmes, all the research to suppress testosterone. It's closed. It's over. It's done.